talked about, it's not like this should be all that new. When we started the first introduction to Angular, we looked at ng model. Although we really haven't looked at it in all the Jute workshops, we've basically just been displaying data. And so we haven't had a need, right? In the next workshop, we're going to end up inserting data, and that's why we're going to end up needing the ng model. But you've seen this stuff before. I mean, this is from the weekend assignment for the sales team. And so, you've seen, in this case, we've got we're inserting a new employee, so we've got an ng model for the name, and some other ng models that we're going to be looking at. So again, this stuff shouldn't be all that new for if you've done anything with Angular where you've had any form data. You've ended up working with ng model. So what I actually want to do here is I have a presentation that we're going to do. But before we do it, I ended up adding my own slide, which is to do a demo, okay? And I want to just be sort of clear about this and make sure that you folks are doing this. When you're trying to learn something, instead of actually going into an existing application and trying to adapt it to that application, simplify it. You guys should be creating, at this point, a ton of demos. You guys should have, you should be doing multiple Angular applications every week. You should be creating them. You should be deleting them. When you go, hey, look, I want to test something new out, don't even open up the old one. Recreate it. Get very, very comfortable with it. Again, I've spoken to other people about this. From my perspective, it's almost like you're playing the piano. It's like practicing scales. I mean, you get in there and you end up creating an application, and it's very, very simplistic to do. I'm going to actually even show you a faster way to set it up without even looking at Express at all, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to go to my terminal. So I actually have a folder of just stuff that's not incredibly important, my Scratch folder here. And I'm going to make a directory, and I'm going to call it form demo. Right, I'm going to end up going into this, and what I'm going to do here is just create a couple of files. One of the things that there's an npm module called HTTP server. So if I end up typing in HTTP server, I have it installed globally. What it does is it actually just creates a web server that'll serve static files. So if I end up going to localhost 8080, it'll actually just show me my directory here. And if I was to go here, and I'm going to open this up in Vim, I was to go in here and I was to add an index.html and put in a HTML tag and a body and a head, let's say. I could go back here, and actually, if I go and reload this, the way that this works is that if you have an index page there, it'll automatically end up loading the index page. That's a web server. You set up a web server with one file and running HTTP server. Okay? So again, setting up these demos is pretty quick to test things out. Now, if I want to bring in Angular and Bootstrap in here really easily, I can say npm init. Okay, and then I could say npm install Bootstrap, Angular, save. So again, this web server just serves up static files. So if I was to go in here, back to my Vim, and if I go over here, I'll look, and I'll see that I have my node modules folder. Here's my Angular, here's my Bootstrap. I could go in here, and I could say script, source equals node modules, Angular, and this is going to be Angular.js. And I could also bring in Bootstrap and say link. This is going to be a style sheet. And this is going to be an href. And again, this is going to be node modules, Bootstrap, dist, CSS, Bootstrap, CSS. So I should see if this ended up loading properly. But I should see at least my font change.
And sorry, your HTTP server, all the path, it's relative to the directory you ran it in?
Yeah, it's all it is basically a static server. It serves up static files, right? So once I do this, just to see that I have Angular, if I type in Angular, that's my sanity check to see that Angular loaded. And what I'm going to do, we're going to do a quick demo to demonstrate how the NG model works with forms to basically do things like make sure that your form doesn't submit until the user gives you the relevant information in the format that you want it. So once we end up doing this, we could go over here and put in a div with a class of container. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a div with a class. I'm going to make this a well, and I'll put a form in here. And so make sure that this is working again. You're seeing it one line at a time with this stuff. And so now I've got this well that's here. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to put a form in. But before we do it, let's actually make sure that we've got Angular working. So here we've got this well, and I'm going to go and put a H3 in and say, enter a new user. And we'll go over here, and just to see that if Angular is set up, it should treat this as a template, and I shouldn't see anything else here. I shouldn't see those brackets, right? And that's not happening, so the reason why that's not happening is that I need to specify that I've got an app here. Just putting in Angular is not enough. I could just do this. And that would be enough just to say that this is an Angular application. Okay? But I actually want it to be my Angular application. So I'm going to put in another script here. And again, just to keep this simple, I'm going to say /app.js. I'll go over here, take this app.js, and in here I'll say Angular module app brackets, and now I'll say equals app. Now it should put me in the same spot, which I'm at, which is good. Now, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a controller here. I'll say ng controller equals new user control. Again, if I just did this, right, one step at a time, I'll get an error. I could go back to my app.js file. And one thing that I noticed, and they do it in Juke a lot, but you don't have to do it. If you don't like the idea of global variables, you could very easily, even breaking up your files, do this. And I did this on some of your NWin stuff. You could grab the module, say controller, new user control, okay, and if we went back here, we should see that error is going to go away. So again, you sort of want to be in the mode, you know, when you're not working on workshops, to build. The more applications you build, the better off, the more comfort zone you're going to end up getting with this stuff. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to start to set up my form in here. And so I'll give this a, let's see, I could say div class form group. This is just a, again, this could give you a little practice with Bootstrap, label, let's say first name, And then we could say input class equals form control. And if we did this, we'd end up start to get a form here. And we could do this with a last name. And let's say we're also going to want to get an email. And let's say we also want to go and put in a submit button. So right below this, we'll say button class equals BTN, BTN primary. I'll make a nice little blue button, and we'll say save. So our goal here is, first of all, we want to basically have some way of capturing this information, okay? So the way that we're going to capture it is that, make this a little bit smaller. The way that we want to capture it is with a model. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting with Angular, if I say ng model, and I'll say new user first name, I'll go over here with this other input control. I'll say ng model, and I'll say new user last name. So here's a directive, right, which will actually go, and if the model doesn't exist, it'll actually create it and put it on the scope. New user.email. And just to see that this exists, over here, let's say right underneath our button, let's put in new user. So now, if I do this, we won't see anything yet, but once we start to type, we'll see that the new user has a first name, has a last name, and has an email. Okay? This is all stuff that we've seen before. The idea of basically saying, hey, look, we want to end up modeling something, we want to be able to capture it, we want to be able to maybe do two-way data binding, which is what we're doing here. We're seeing that this model is getting created, we can display the model. Now, again, there would be nothing wrong with setting some default values. Okay, you can imagine if this was an edit form and you were getting it from the database, then probably what you would have is that in your module here, we could go in here and we could grab our scope, and we could say scope dot new user is an object, and we could say first name is going to be foo, just to give it something, in which case we're going to see our model binding in action, we'll see our model here, and so on and so forth, right? So that's, again, a quick, very, very basic introduction to what ng model does, okay? ng model, we could imagine that ng model is displaying, it's being used to display and to manipulate the value property of an input tag.
So I have a question. I was talking with a few students about this before. You do not need to declare your ng model variables on the scope. They're declared implicitly when you write them into your form directive.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any performance difference, though, between declaring them, pre-declaring them on the scope, or just having them all declared implicitly?
You know what? If there is, it's got to be incredibly minimal. I mean, what it really comes down to is if you need it. I mean, if you don't need it, you don't have to declare it. If you're going to need it, then declare it. I mean, it will be available, even if you don't do this. It is being added to the scope, whether you like it or not. I mean, even if we end up, just to sort of show you this, if I do an ng click over here, so if I go over here and I say, hey, look, when this is clicked on, and I say ng click is save. So I call the save method when this gets clicked on. And let's go back to our, let's go back over here. Even if I take this out, and I say scope.save is equal to a function, and I say console.log scope new user. Now, if in fact none of these fields are filled out, it'll tell me it's undefined. But if one of the fields is filled out, I'll get an object back. Now, the bottom line here is what we're going to be looking at here is we want to, and this is purely from a usability perspective, right? We don't want the user to try to click the submit button, the save button, unless their data is valid, okay? This is not protecting anything on our database. There's ways of getting around it that are very easy, which we'll end up looking at when we end up getting to one of the workshops that deals with security. But one of the things you could do here is that if I end up putting this, I'm going to modify this a little bit. And what I'm going to do is instead of just putting this in a div, I'm going to put this in a form. So I'm going to take all this, I'm going to nest this inside of a form, move this stuff over. And I think this needs to go down over here. Okay, so that's my well. So now I'm inside of a form here. Now I want to show you something that's kind of interesting. A form, a plain old form, is actually a directive in Angular. And you can actually access, what ends up happening is that you can end up accessing that form programmatically if you end up giving that form a name. So I'm going to give this form a name. I'm going to say this is going to be the new user form. I could do that. Doesn't really mean anything to anybody up to this point. This will all be exactly the same right now. But I want to show you that once you end up doing that, what happens is that on the scope, you're going to have access to this form. And when you have access to this form on the scope, I'm going to go right underneath here, and I'm going to put a new user form. Let's take a look and see what that tells us. Okay? Well, this,
a little bigger.
surely. Okay? So these are all properties. Again, this object is dynamically created with the directive, right? You have a scope, you have this directive which you're unaware of. Okay? The form is actually a directive. Angular looks at it, ends up treating it as a directive, the same way that Angular treats, you know, our NG controller as a directive, right? And so what will happen here is you can see that some of these values will change, okay? As I start typing in here, notice it says, hey, dirty is true, pristine is false. Pristine just means that you ended up just starting to type into it. Notice it also is telling me that the form is valid, okay? It says the form is valid. From its perspective, it's valid. I haven't put any requirements on it, okay? Once I go in here, and I go in here inside this first name, so there's a HTML attribute that you could use, and the browser could actually put in some controls on this as well, but we're going to let Angular do it. There's a attribute you could put in on a, and this is was an HTML5 thing, I think, where you could basically say, hey, look, this is going to be required. And once I end up putting that attribute on here, notice I have some more information, okay? So here I've got my, I could look over here and I could see that this is no longer valid. If I start to type something in here, you can see now it's valid. So now I've got this object and I can specify whether or not this thing is valid. And so what this gives me the ability to do is real simply, I've got this thing on my scope, it's got a valid property, and I could go to my button here. I could specify, hey, look, don't let the user click it, let's disable it. NG disabled. Okay? And we could say if new user form invalid, not valid. There's also an invalid property, which would get me the same thing, but we were looking at valid before, right? So I've got my new user form. NG disabled it. Let's disable it if it's not valid. And now when I go back here, I should, in fact, see that this is not clickable. Now it is. Fair amount of bang for the buck with a couple of attributes on your form. Okay? Let's just do another couple of things, then we'll actually get into the lecture a little bit. Let's go up here. Let me delete this so it's not so noisy. And let's also put a required on here. And we'll go over here, and again, the only way that I get to put anything down here is if both these are filled out, okay? Let's get rid of the noise on here a little bit more, and we'll look at one more thing. So another thing that we might want to do is we might want to specify that this, and again, there's all types of different logic you could state. Maybe you say, look, you know what, the email's not required, but if they do decide to put it in, it better be an email. So there's actually a type attribute. By default, your input fields are text. You could specify, and again, this is an HTML thing, but Angular is aware of it too. You could say type is email, okay? So when you do that, okay, not valid, now I'm valid, no longer valid, okay? Because I put in something that's not an email, and how stringent it is, I don't know. Not asking for the .com, but probably close enough. You could, write your own validation if you want to. The last thing that I want to do is that you could actually get access to the individual fields themselves. Because right now, when there's stuff that's invalid, we're not letting the user know specifically that it's not valid. So what we could do here, the same way that you could name your form, okay? The same way that you could name your form, you could also name your form field. So if I go over here to first name, I'm going to give this a name of first name. And I'll give this a name of last name. Okay? And I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to print out here. Okay? I have on my scope, new user form, first name. I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to ask whether or not, right? So we have a form. We could ask if it's valid. We have an input control. We could also get its valid property. If we go over here and we reload this, right? Not valid, valid. So you could do something like this. We could say span class equals label, label error, and we'll say ng show if in fact new form, new user form, I think we could actually just say if it's invalid, right? So we'll show this if it's invalid. For now, I'll just put an asterisk here. Right? So why is that not showing? Because I think I don't have a space here. Maybe not. Let's say maybe. I didn't think that would do it, but maybe you're right. let's see, I'm going to say not valid. New user form. Let's try, maybe Oliver, you're onto something. You think double quotes here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think that was it. Let's actually just see. You think I named it something? Yeah. It should be right next to it. Please fill out this field. Let's see. Let's actually do something first. Make sure we have something correct. All right, one line at a time here. Do we have a red box? No. Okay. So label error. Okay. Let's take our class out of here. Because I think I'm inside another tag. All right, there's my hello. Give it a class of label. What does that do? Nothing. Labels go away. Okay. Label default. Okay. Label danger. Okay. So we're going to show this label of danger, ng show, and we're going to say if new user form first name invalid. Okay. When we start typing, that ends up going away. And again, you could worry about your placement and that sort of thing. Maybe put it next to it. Yeah.
Since you have your input field names, you still need that ng model?
Yes.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm. The naming has to do with accessing it in the form, but it's not automatically going to create a model for you. Okay? So you could end up doing this now. Let's just... Go ahead.
If you didn't have those ties in the ng model, could you, when you submit or when you call it, can you actually access the data from that form dot, whatever the form name dot first name? No.
I don't know. You maybe could access it, but you're probably better off accessing it through a model. So let's just do one other thing here. Now, again, this is pure usability. Some might look at this and say, boy, that's a little bit annoying. I didn't start filling anything out yet, and you're breaking my chops about this, right? So, I mean, maybe one thing you could do is you could say, hey, look, let's show it if the new user form, we've got this pristine, dirty. It's so dirty to have that. Okay, so we do that, and now it doesn't show up. We start to type, but then we change our mind and we go back. Now maybe it's fair that we end up displaying that. So two things that I sort of wanted to get out of this is to sort of show you again, the key things when you want to control your validation is you want to end up giving your form a name and you want to give your input elements a name. That's what's going to allow you to do that. That's a directive which will automatically end up putting objects on the scope that you could access about their validity. If there was more logic in terms of things being valid, you could think about the Northwind sales where we were determining validity if one thing was selected. There's a way basically you can watch things, which we haven't done yet, and you could actually set the validity of the form based upon whatever criteria you want to select. And you could do that with some kind of method. Not something we have to do in the workshop, but I don't want you to think that it's, basically the validation could get as complex as you need it to be. All right? So let's actually take a look at our slides, which I think will make a lot more sense now that we ended up looking at this. And again, very important to create a lot of demos. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I give you guys the weekend assignments when we're not here, not getting them back from everybody, although a lot of people are doing them. You really should all be doing. And again, if you're not, then you should be creating at least one simple demo a day at a minimum, if you want to keep me from bugging you. If you like me bugging you, then don't do it. Okay, so this is a quote, right? The idea that people love doing form validations. It's such a great exercise to do, you know? No one likes it. These are just some examples of, you know, things that you might end up validating. So if you have, you know, in this case, we've got a, you know, payment form, a bunch of options that are here. And maybe what you're doing is that when the form ends up getting submitted, you're going in and you're using some, without, you know, Angular, you're using some way of accessing these DOM elements. And then maybe you're looking at these DOM elements. You're seeing if they have a value. And then maybe you decide to, you know, maybe make it a little bit more robust and have some other properties that you look at. And then things end up changing again, and you want to make sure, hey, look, we don't end up submitting the form accidentally, so you have to put this event prevent default in. And then maybe there's some other things that you decide to do. Does the credit card match that particular credit card type? And you go on, and you really just want to crawl into the fetal position because it's pretty thankless, really. I mean, it's not like this is the greatest feature ever built, but it's incredibly important from a usability perspective. So again, there's major issues with doing these validations, and Angular comes to the rescue. You've seen it. I mean, I showed it to you in the demo, but just to sort of look, you know, at how this can end up working. You've got a pattern for handling input valids. It's declarative, right? You don't even have to do anything in terms of putting stuff on the controller. You could declare it directly on the template. That's kind of what we mean by declarative. You're not really writing code. You're actually just putting attributes within tags, and it's doing the work for you to make your buttons disabled or to display messages when things aren't valid. You can end up composing inputs together, which we did. You have these inputs together inside of forms, and you can end up building this custom validation. And there's even ways to end up making it reusable, where if you had some methods for validation, you could end up putting them in a factory and end up reusing them. So this is all relying around this NG model. Again, this is a built-in attribute directive. And again, we're using it for two-way data binding, right? You've seen this before, where when you end up putting in the NG model, right, you then have this value that's available on your scope, right? We usually end up doing this because we're usually dealing not with one value, but dealing with objects. So we would set up this, you know, card.type. And again, the key takeaway here, it's not like you have to set up this card object on your scope. It'll get created automatically when the user starts typing in any of these fields that are here, or selecting any of the fields. So you could actually have an NG model on a select object, and its value would be the item that ended up getting selected. This is what you'll end up using in the workshop. Behind this, there's actually a NG model controller, which is invisible to you, but this is actually what's doing all the work, right? There's a controller that gets created that's associated with that NG model, and that's what's adding all these things to the scope for you. That's why you end up, you know, having this value that's available on the scope, even though you haven't put it on the scope directly, right? An NG model ends up adding something to the scope. So there's a number of different validation directives that you could use. You could use NG required, but frankly, you could just use required. If you use required, It's the same thing as using ng required, no difference. You could use a minimum length. You could do a maximum length. You could do a pattern if there's some regular expression that you're looking for. You could do an email. You could do a number. You could do a URL. And you could end up, we've seen this too, where a form itself ends up turning out to be a directive, which again, just like the ng model, ends up adding something to the scope, which you could then end up accessing. By naming your form, you're going to have something on your scope that you can determine whether or not it's valid. So again, you have this whole idea where behind the scenes there's this model controller, and it's looking at this and really composing the ng models which are below it and determining whether or not they're valid by looking at what the other attributes, what the attributes are on those inputs, whether or not they're required or not. So again, we saw this with the demo, the idea of, you know, here I'm going to end up inputting something. I want to determine whether or not a form is valid. So if we had, you know, a situation like this, we could end up giving this a name. And if we end up giving these a name, all these things are going to end up being accessible. And we could do things, you know, like putting messages over here. Hey, look, you know, if this was, we wanted to put some requirements here, put some requirements here. Once we have a name on our form, and once we have a name on our input fields, then we have a way of accessing them through the scope, even though we didn't declare them on the scope. We have a way of accessing them through the scope, and we can do things like limiting whether or not the user could end up submitting the form, whether or not we end up disabling the form, whether or not we end up showing the form, whether or not we end up showing validation messages. And we have pretty tight control over this. And really what this does is it's going to, you know, whether or not you do it or whether or not somebody else does it, very often you'll have someone who's got familiarity with user experience and says, hey, look, this is the way, this is a very, very important input form. We've got a lot of people using this site. We want them to have a good user experience. We want them to know when this thing is filled out correctly. So they might say, hey, look, we don't want these messages to show unless the user started typing something in. And that's where you can end up looking at whether or not this thing is pristine, whether it's dirty, and whether, you know, all a bunch of different other properties that you have. So that's going to do it for this presentation. I'm going to make this available. I'm going to pair you guys up for this forms, which I think if it's not up there, I'll put it up there, but there's going to be, I'll open up the workshop. I'll also do the, make sure that the repo is up there for you guys to start with. You had a question?
Yeah, so maybe I'm not understanding this correctly. So once you give the input field names and you have a name form, you can access that form and all of the input data on the scope, right?
I think you're looking at it the wrong way. I think the way that you should be looking at it is that once your form has a name, and once your inputs have names, you can determine whether or not they're valid.
Okay, but you can't.
The data is through the model.
You can't necessarily access what was entered, like the actual.
You wouldn't want to. Yeah. You want to access the input, use the ng model, and my guess is, based upon what I've seen, if you don't have the ng model, I don't know if this is going to work at all. Because I think that this is wrapping around the ng model.
My question, like, isn't it repetitive when I also have the ng model, you can access everything?
Maybe, but you have to access it through the form. Maybe it is repetitive. Angular is not perfect, right? And it's very easy to see whether or not you need them. You can take them out and see if it works. I think you need them, and I think you probably, we know for sure you want the model.
The directive, you know, the form directive probably can't work without the model.
That's actually what I'm guessing. All right. I don't know. I mean, it could be that your name is different from model. You're right. It does feel a little bit redundant.
Besides setting like the type and let's say like required, you can make a custom function.
I think you could set a custom function. I don't know.
Set like valid to true or false.
I think if it was a custom function, then I think what you would do is I think you would end up watching the model. And I think what you would do is you would look at that model changing, and you would watch that model. Every time the model changed, you would run some custom function. An example, this is the perfect example for this. Users filling out a new user form, they put in a username. You want to let them know if that username's been taken. That's actually going to be asynchronous, okay? So what you would do there is you would look at the model, you would end up blocking the model. You'd make a call back to the server to find out if that username has been taken or not, and then you could set the validity directly of your, through the form. And I think you could specify, hey look, form.email is it valid or not? I don't know, I mean, I think the thing is why it might, I don't know if the model itself, the NG model itself has a valid property. I think you sort of have to access it through the form. I could be wrong about it, but it's something you could take a look at.
Yeah,
But
I don't think it does.
Yeah,
Because you said, you know, you said sometimes reset pristine,
right.
and you do that to a function usually, right? Like you'll do a bunch of stuff, and then you'll clear a bunch of fields, and it's reset pristine on the whole form.
Okay, yeah, right. So there's also methods that you could end up calling on the form directive to specify directly, hey, look, I've decided that this form is invalid based upon some combination of things. I mean, it's not a stupid example. Someone's missing first name and last name. You're exactly right. You could end up getting
Just adding on, Angular has really great form built-in directives from a UX perspective. Some of the functions, though, are a little spotty. Set pristine, for example, I think is actually deprecated. Yeah, I've had a lot of trouble with that in the past. So I've had to, you may find that you need to write a function that manually clears the form, which is trivial to do.
or manually clears the form, but we don't really think about clearing the form. We think about just changing the model.
Yeah, that's right. Setting your various model variables to an empty string or to null or something like that before you go again. But that's just a pattern I've noticed is that some of the form functions are lacking, whereas the form directives and checkers and things like